All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem, a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, to thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the Shiurim and Joshua this month in honor of their grandchildren, Tikva, Esther, Simcha, Avigayim, Milana, Milcenta. May they grow up to become the best version of themselves. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Bill and Razi Eskin, Lezecher Nishmas, Bill's father, Mordechai ben David, and Razi's mother, Tzivya Bas Moshe Aaron. To thank the Daf Yomi Chavra for dedicating the shir this week in the Schos of Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal. We hope that he, together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, will have a complete and enduring refuah. Now, we'll see with that, let us begin with a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Sorry, some technical difficulties over here, but we're going to be all right. So we left off, today's daf is Chav Zayin 27, and we are picking up in Mirat Hashem on Chav Vav Amud Beis 26b at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says as follows. We began this yesterday, but we'll get a little bit more in depth into it today. So the Mishnah says as follows: Ha'isha shenech b'shabidei oved kochavim. If a woman was taken captive about Gentile captors, so I will say, what's the concern? So we know that in general, the halacha assumes that if a woman is taken captive, she is violated by her captors. The concern is that at a certain point in time, does she submit willingly to her captors? The problem with that, of course, is that could be tantamount to adultery, and therefore halacha l'maisa could render her prohibited to her husband. That's the underlying concern in this. So the Gemara says, it depends why she was taken. The Mishnah says, "Aidei mammon mutaras labayla." If at the end of the day she was taken captive for financial reasons, to extort money, then she is mutara, she is permitted to her husband, because the assumption is that if she is kidnapped because of monetary purposes, her captors will not abuse her. However, al yidei nefashos asur labayla. However, again, halacha l'maisa, if she's taken captive because of some type of capital reason, then halacha l'maisa, in other words, yidei nefashos, we'll see what that means in the Gemara. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, first of all, Rashi says, "Aidei mamon mutaras labayla demisarsi or demirasisi lahafsid mamon ve'inam afkirin osa," because they're concerned. The captors could be concerned that halacha l'maisa, if they abuse her, that they'll lose the ability to collect the money. Therefore, they don't abuse her. However, al yidei nefashos, Rashi says, shaisani donis lamos. So Rashi here explains that nefashos means, let's say she was judged to die. Let's say she was taken captive either because of a capital offense that she had committed or because of what her husband had committed. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, there's no concern about abusing her, and therefore we have to assume that she was violated. And then again, over time, the concern is that halacha l'maisa, she may have submitted willingly. Therefore, again, asur labayla, she becomes prohibited to her husband. So let's qualify this halacha. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchok Amar Rav, Lo shanu ela shei yisrael tekifa al dei kochavim. They will say, when do we say that if she's taken captive for monetary purposes, that we could assume that her captives did not abuse her? That's in a situation where literally Yad Yisrael Tekifa, the hand of the Jewish people, is strong. In other words, we're talking about a situation where people respect the Jewish people. However, avayad ovdei kochavim tekifa. But if halacha l'maisa, again, Rashi says over here, sheyad Yisrael tekifa ala ovdei kochavim, v'yireim laso shelo kedin, shema yafsidu mamonam. There's both this fascinating qualification. So Rav essentially says, when do we assume that if a woman is taken captive for monetary purposes, that she's not abused by her captors? That's only where there is some element of fear that the Gentile captors have from the Jews, or of the Jews, I should say. But halacha l'maisa, if you have a situation of ayat ovdei kochavim tekifa al atzman, but if ultimately, again, the Gentile captors have no fear of the Jews, in other words, the Gentile population is in absolute control, then afilu al yidei maman asur labayla. Then in that case, halacha l'maisa, even if she's taken captive because of monetary purposes, we assume that her captors abused her. Fascinating distinction. So Massive Rava, raised the question. Heid Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zechariah ben Akazov. So Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zechariah ben Akazov both testified. Abbas Yisrael Shahorahana ba'Ashkelon. or shehurhana ba'ashkelon. Now, both say, what does hurhana mean? Rashi says nismashkina. Now, this is actually an interesting case of a Jewish woman seized as collateral. So I will say, it appears that what happened over here is someone collateralized this woman. So what ended up happening over here is whoever it was that collateralized her defaulted on the loan, and she was literally seized. This Jewish woman was seized as collateral. So what's the Gemara says? So that's the story. She was seized in Ashkelon. And ultimately, again, her family distanced themselves from her. They distanced themselves from her. And I will say, and at the end of the day, this appears, if you look at Rashi over here, actually not yet. So I will say, so the idea over here is, now why did they distance themselves from her? They distanced themselves because they assumed that halacha l'maisa, she was violated by her captors, and again, had this concern that perhaps she submitted willingly. Now what happened? Another part of the story. And now she had witnesses who testified that she was never alone with her captors, and therefore, again, by extension, was never violated by her captors. Now the Chacham said to the family, if you believe that she was collateralized, right, that she was seized as collateral, then you should believe the witnesses that she was never secluded and never violated. And if you don't believe that she was not, if you don't believe the witnesses, that ultimately, again, that she wasn't alone and that she wasn't violated, Al taminu shuhurhana. Do not believe that she was collateralized as well. So in other words, I will say, what the Chacham were saying to the family was, again, either believe everything or believe nothing. In other words, if you're going to believe that she was collateralized, or seized as collateral, then believe the witnesses that she was never violated. But halacha l'maisa, if you're not going to believe the witnesses that she wasn't violated, then you shouldn't believe that she was seized as collateral as well. In other words, which was the Chacham's way of saying, you absolutely should believe what the witnesses are saying. Now, what's the important part for our story in this? Ashkelon diad ovdei kochavim tekifa alatzman. Now, we'll say Ashkelon, Rashi says over here, was a Philistine city. And it historically was a city that was not controlled by the Jewish population. So here you have Ashkelon as an example of a city where the Gentiles are in charge of themselves. Therefore, there's no fear of the Jews. And yet what? V'katani top of Chav Zayin, v'katani horhana in nechbisha lo. So I will say, interestingly enough, it sounds like the problem in this case was because the woman was seized as collateral. Look at Rashi, top Rashi and Chav Zayin, horhana. Rashi says demidas v'chivan di'egia zman v'lo niftis. Being taken as collateral is different than what? Than being taken captive. Because Rabbi say, again, which is a fascinating idea of collateralizing a person, but when you seize something as collateral, Rabbi say, who owns that object? Who owns that object? The creditor. So it could very well be that in a case of being seized as collateral, that's where you need the eidos. But I both say we could infer from here, it's only because of the case of collateral that you required eidos. But in a case perhaps of being taken captive, perhaps ultimately again, because it's for monetary purposes, we would assume she wasn't violated, even though what? This was a city where there was no Gentile fear of Jews. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo, huwa din afilu nechbesha. Truth is not necessarily, it would be the same halacha even if she was taken captive for monetary purposes. It just happens to be, this is how the story unfolded. So the Gemara is just saying, don't read into this story about Dafka being taken as collateral but not being taken captive. No, the story was that she was taken as collateral. That was the Maisa, but it could very well be that the same halacha would have applied had she been taken captive. And I will say, therefore, this proves Rav, or it doesn't disprove Rav's assertion, which is that when the Mishnah says that if a woman is taken captive because of monetary issues, that we assume that she was not violated by her captors. When is that? Only in a situation where the Gentile captors were fearful of the Jews. In other words, there was some level of Jewish autonomy in that area. But if there's no level of Jewish autonomy, so Gentiles have no fear of Jews, then even if she's taken captive for monetary purposes, I still have to assume that what? She was violated by her captors. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Ike da Amri, so we'll say an alternate version of this. Ike da Amri, Amar Rava, Af Anan Nami Tanina. Rava said, we also learn this. Hey, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zechariah ben Akasav, Abbas Yisrael, Shehur HaNaba Ashkelon, the Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zechariah ben Akasav, they testified about a Jewish woman who was taken as collateral in Ashkelon, Vericha Kamanei Mishpachta, and her family distanced themselves from her. I will say, by the way, it's actually interesting that you'll ask yourself, why would the family distance themselves from her? Sounds so terrible. Rashi seems to understand that the case in question over here is where the woman borrowed the money and she collateralized herself. In other words, she did this to herself. So her family is like a shtickle frustrated with her about making poor decisions. So again, I don't know that justifies a family distancing themselves from a family member in need, but Lamaisa perhaps gives a bit more context. In any event, so what happened? And witnesses testified that she was never alone and she was never violated. And what happened? The Chachamim said to the family, Im atem ma'aminim shehur hana haminu shelo nistera. If you believe the witnesses, right? If you believe that she was collateralized, then believe the witnesses that ultimately she was not alone and not violated. And if you don't believe that she was not alone and she wasn't defiled, al taminu shehur hana, don't believe that she was taken as collateral as well. In other words, the Chachamim are saying to the family, I don't understand why you're selectively believing information. Either believe all of the information at hand, and all of the information is what? All the information is what? She was seized as collateral, and what? She wasn't alone and she wasn't violated. Or believe none of the information. But why are you selectively believing information? The Gemara is supposed to say same story, it's presented a little bit differently. Ashkelon, the Ayidei Mamanhu. But I will say the case in Ashkelon is, why was she seized? She was seized for monetary purposes. V'taima de eide me'idin osa. And the reason why she would be permitted is because there are witnesses that testify that she was not violated. But what do you see from here? If there weren't witnesses who were testifying on her behalf, then halacha lamaisa, ultimately again, we would not believe them. In other words, we would assume that she was violated, even though this was what? Being taken captive for monetary purposes. To which the Gemara says, my love, loshna hurhana, v'loshna nechbesha. Can we not assume that it makes no difference if a person is seized as collateral or a person is taken captive? To which the Gemara says, lo hurhana shiny. No, being taken as collateral is different. And also you could hear this, by the way. Even if you accept the premise that a woman taken captive for monetary purposes is not violated by her captors, you could see why a case of being taken as collateral would be different. And halacha l'maisa, why a captor may violate the woman who's taken as collateral, because again, when a person is seized as collateral, there's almost like what? There's almost as if the captor might feel a more justifiable approach in violating that woman, because as a feeling of a certain level of ownership. Rashi, thank you so much. It's perfect. Thank you so much. So the Gemara says as follows: Ika derami lemirma. Others, Rabbi say, contrast this ruling. And what do they say? Tanan, Rabbi say, others, so in other words, others go ahead and highlight it as a contradiction. Watch this. The Gemara says, Tanan, al yudei mamon mutaris labayla. If ultimately a woman is seized as collateral, if a woman is taken captive for monetary purposes, she is permitted to her husband. So the Gemara says, or minhi, hey Rabbi Yossi. So also the Gemara quotes the story. Ashkelon da ayidei mammon. Ashkelon is an example of where the woman was seized for monetary purposes. Vikatani, and yet we learned taima, the edim meidin osa. And the only reason why she was permitted to her husband in that case, was because there are witnesses testifying on her behalf. Ha'ein edim meidin osa lo. If there were not witnesses testifying on her behalf, ultimately again, she would not be permitted. Umishani Amrav Shmuel Barav Bar Yisrael Kashya Kan Shiyad Yisrael Tekifa Al Yidei Ovdei Gochavim Kad Shiyad Ovdei Gochavim Tekifa Al Atzman. And I will say one of the ways in which we resolve that is that halacha lemaisa. One case is talking about a situation where Jews are in control, and one is talking about where Gentiles are in control. So Rabbi say, bottom line, here's what comes out. If we bring this all together, it appears that the Gemara does in fact accept the qualification of Rav. So here's what we have, if we just condense it all together, is the Mishnah makes a statement. What was the statement of the Mishnah? If a woman is taken captive by Gentile captors for monetary purposes, let's define by that. What does monetary purposes mean? What does monetary purposes mean? There might be something on the Zoom side. I'm sorry, I didn't know how to change it. Right, what does monetary purposes mean? Either, halacha lemaisa, she owes someone money and she's being seized captive until someone pays the debt, or someone else related to her ultimately owes money, and halacha lemaisa, she's being seized to extort the money. In that case, the Mishnah says, halacha lemaisa, we could assume that she is not violated by her captors, out of fear that her captors will fear that if they harm her, they won't get their money. They won't get their money. Good. That's the premise of the Mishnah. Rav qualifies that and says, when is that true? That's only true in a situation where halacha lemaisa what? Jews are feared by the Gentiles, or Jews have some level of control in this particular vicinity where the captivity is happening. So there's some level of respect for the Jew, and therefore the Gentile is not going to harm the captive because they want their money. But if the Gentiles are totally in control, right? So therefore, again, there's no fear of the Jew. And therefore, whether they harm the captive or not, they're going to go ahead and get their money. Then halacha lemaisa, we would fear that the woman is violated even in a case of financial captivity. That was Rav's qualification. And the Gemara essentially went ahead and proved that point by the story in Ashkelon. What does the story in Ashkelon come to convey to us also? That there are different levels of financial captivity. That you could have a situation of a woman who is taken captive because the captors want to extort money from someone else. That's when it appears that as long as it's a situation of where Jews are in control, halacha l'maisa, they won't harm the captive. But there's another case of financial captivity, which is what? Collateral. And it seems to be that in a case of collateral, what do we have to be concerned about? That the woman would be violated. Because since in the case of collateral, the person who's seizing the collateral, i.e. the creditor, feels a certain sense of ownership and entitlement to the collateral, then in that case, even if Yad Yisrael Tekifa, perhaps she was violated. Okay, incredible Gemara. So let's go right there. Aidi Mefashas Asura. The Rabbi say now, remember again, the Mishnah went ahead and added something different, or the Mishnah added something additional, which is that if she is seized because of capital purpose, in other words, Rabbi say, this is either because halacha l'maisa, we're going to see, let's say she killed someone and therefore was sentenced to death, or someone close to her killed someone and was sentenced to death, and she was seized as a result of that. In that situation, we assume that her captors violate her. Gemara explains, Amarav kegon noshe ganvi. So this is very interesting. Rav says, for example, the wives of thieves. If you look at Rashi says over Hani Nashi Ganvi, Shabalei Nitlin, V'derach Hamalchus Lahafkir Beisamun Hashem. So Rabbi said it's actually interesting. The Gemara says like this: in certain areas, the halacha was that if you stole, you were sentenced to death. Part of the death sentence was also that what? So your property as well as your wife became hefker. So in a situation like that, halacha l'maisa, the wife of a thief, the wife essentially becomes hefker. So if someone takes her captive, again, then you have to assume that she was violated, because halacha l'maisa, there are no repercussions for doing anything to her. So the Gemara goes right to the Gemara. V'levi Amar kigon ishto shel ben donoi. An example of this is like the wife of ben donoi. Who's ben donoi? Rashi says rotzeach haya. He was a murderer. Ve'elazar shmo, apparently a Jewish murderer named Elazar ben donoi. So we'll say this is just a bit of a machlokes over here. So Rav says that generally thieves were sentenced to death, and their wives and property made hefker. So it comes along Levi, and Levi says, no, not thieves, murderers. So the murder, when a person was accused of murder, their estate was made hefker, and the wife was made hefker. So we'll say, they're agreeing on the premise. The idea over here is, in a situation where someone committed the type of crime where their estate and their spouse was made hefker, if a woman was seized in that type of situation, you have to assume that she was violated by her captors. Amr Chizkiah, v'hu nigmar dino laharigo. Dino laharigo. Chizkiah says, but this is only for if the husband's sentence, or if the husband was actually sentenced, right? He was actually sentenced by a court. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Afal Pisha Lo Nigmar Dina Lahari. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, even if they were not officially sentenced, people still treated their wives and their property like hefker. Okay? We'll say incredible. That's the sugya. Says the Mishnah. So we'll say now we come to another fascinating sugya here. Ir Shekavshua Karkum. So we'll say here's the situation. You have a city that is surrounded by a siege. Look at Rashi. Karkum Matzor, a city surrounded by a siege. I'll just point out, by the way, we're reading these cases as just halachic cases, but again, it's also the timing of it is incredible that we read these cases during the 9 days, where when we go through the kinnis on Tisha B'Av, we'll see so much of these type of circumstances reflected in our historical reality about situations like this, right? Right? So we'll say ultimately again a Klal Yisrael being disrespected, Klal Yisrael, men, women, children being treated like chattel, being treated like property. This was a reality of our historical experience. We're reading it again, just as a Mishnah and a Gemara, but it's never a coincidence, the timing that we learn these sugyas as well. So the Mishnah says as follows: She'ir shekav shua karkum. So now you have a city that is surrounded by a siege. So what's the halacha? Kol kohanos shenimtzu b'socham psulos. I would say all of the wives of Kohanim who are inside of the city become prohibited to their husbands. And I will say, remember again, a wife of a Kohen, even if she is violated against her will, still becomes prohibited to her husband. The wife of a Yisrael, if she is violated, does not become prohibited to her husband. Again, the previous Mishnah discussed that perhaps as a result of sustained captivity, we have a concern that she may come to submit willingly to her captor. At that point in time, it becomes adultery. But Lamaisi, here the Mishnah is talking about something more immediate. The moment that there is a siege, we have to assume that the soldiers come into the city, violate the women. In that case, the wives of Yisraelim will still be permitted to their husbands, but the wives of Kohanim will be prohibited. So the Gemara says as follows. So what's the halacha? V'myeshlam edim. But if these women, if the wives of Kohanim have edim that what? Edim that they were not violated. V'myeshlam edim afilu eved v'afilu shifcha. If they have edim, even if the eved, even if the aid, even if the witness is an eved or a shifcha, hare elu ne'emanin. Ultimately, again, they are believed to attest to the kashrus of their mistress, of the wife of the Kohen. Ve'ein ne'eman adam alatzma. However, a person is not believed ultimately, again, to testify on their own behalf. So let's say a woman, the wife of the Kohen, would not be believed to say, I was not violated. And that's because the Chazakah says they were violated. So again, in order to overturn the Chazakah, you could produce even minimal level of eidos. So an eved, a shifcha, but a person is not believed to testify on their own behalf. Incredible halacha. Bosai says the Gemara, or minhu. So Bosai, by the way, you also see from a Mishnah, Bosai, I just want to point out, you see from the Mishnah, like what the realities of war were like. I will say, think about this, just an incredible Mishnah. This is saying, here you have a siege around the city. Every single wife of a Kohen becomes prohibited to her husband. You understand what that means? That the halacha looks at this as a certainty that women were violated. That all the women were violated by the invading troops. I will say they had these stories in the early, when war with Ukraine was still like a news story. I will say so they had this in the beginning of the war. They had these documented stories of Russian soldiers coming in and abusing these Ukrainian women, and it was amazing to see that the Wall Street Journal had a whole series of articles on this about how sexual exploitation has always been a primary tool of invading armies. That's what you do in order to subjugate the local population. And it's incredible. I just want to point out what this means is you have a city that's under siege. The Mishnah says every single Ashes Kohen becomes prohibited to her husband. He'll say, what does that tell you? That tells you it's not just the pshat that violation of women was something episodic. Not episodic, it was systemic. It was systemic. That's what it was systemic. In fact, the assumption is that a woman was violated unless, of course, what? You have eidos to the contrary. In other words, I have to bring eidos that she wasn't violated. That's just to understand historical realities in such a dramatic fashion. We assume she was violated unless, of course, you bring eidos to the contrary. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Urminu, I'll bring a kasha. Balesha shabal ear. So it says, this is an interesting case. Balesha shabal say is a troop. Rashi says, Chel al shem she mechapsim kala matmunim. Shabal say, interestingly, a baleshes is a group of soldiers. Why is it called the baleshes? Rashi says that name comes from the fact that when they come in, when soldiers came in, the first thing they did is they took advantage of the fact that they were in a local town, and they took everything they could. They looked for all the hidden treasure. So listen to this case. B'shas shalom, if the soldiers are coming in a time of peace, okay, then what's the halacha? Chaviyos psuchos asuros stumos mutaros. Open barrels of wine are asur. Closed barrels of wine are mutter. Then I will say, what is that distinction? What's going on over here? See, in times of peace, we assume that halacha l'maisa, soldiers are going to drink. If non-Jewish soldiers go ahead and partake of Jewish wine, then what's the halacha? Stam yenam, right? So any wine touched by a non-Jewish person becomes unconsumed, cannot be consumed by a Jew. So we assume if it's times of peace, any open barrels, the soldiers will help themselves to, but they won't open up closed barrels. That's what we assume. So therefore, open barrels are prohibited, closed barrels are permitted. However, the Gemara says, if the soldiers come in during times of war, elu ve'elu mutaros, lefi she'in p'nai l'nasech. But I will say, if it's a time of war, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, all the barrels everything is permitted. Why? Because we assume that since it's a time of war, the soldiers are preoccupied with fighting battles and therefore don't have time to drink. But I will say, but based on that, why don't we make the same distinction by violating women as well, right? And why don't we say again, maybe if it's a time of peace, I understand that they'd be violating, but if it's a time of war, the soldiers are preoccupied with fighting war and don't have time to violate women. We will say is incredible. Amar Mari, live all yesh pinai, linasech ein pinai. I will say the Gemara answers something so dramatic in terms of human nature. The truth is, in a time of war, they don't have time to offer up libations to their gods. So there's no fear of avodah zarah. But in times of war, they still have time to violate women. In other words, I will say, it's such. First of all, in general, there's also something deeper that's being highlighted over here, which is, I will say, war by definition requires man to go ahead and release certain carnal instincts, right? To go ahead and go to war and fight and take life. You have to become to a certain degree a bit more animal than man. That's the way it works. So I will say this is why the Chizkuni brings down after Pinchas kills Zimri and Cozbi. It's interesting. What's Pinchas's reward for killing Zimri and Cozbi? Henini no sein lo brisi shalom. Really? You're giving Pinchas the covenant of peace? You're giving him brisi shalom after he just killed in a pretty vicious way a man and a woman? The answer is yes. Because Cheshbon Baruch was saying to Pinchas, you got to keep it in check. Because obviously the fact that you could do such an act of religious zealotry and kill two people in one fell swoop, to do that, there had to be a certain animalistic side of you that was unlocked. We're going to keep that tempered by giving you brisi shalom. When Klal Yisrael goes in under Yoshua to go ahead and conquer Eretz Yisrael, why 7 years? Why 7 years? Why not just do a shock and awe campaign and just clear it all out at once? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Pentirba alecha chayos hasad is lashon of the pasuk. Lest the animal of the field overtake you. Which animal of the field? It's not the external animal. It's the inner animal. See, sometimes in life things need to get done. But those things, when we do them, they fundamentally change us. And it's important, especially war. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, we're going to take war slowly, so that we have the ability to fight, rehabilitate. Fight, rehabilitate, fight, rehabilitate. Kadosh Baruch Hu already understood that soldiers often suffer from PTSD. Right? This is not like a new dynamic, because war changes you. So therefore, the only way to do that is to rehabilitate the soldier at different intervals. So it's just incredible over here. What the Gemara is saying is like this: oh yeah, during a time of war, there is no time for avodah zarah. No time. God is put on the back shelf, right? So don't worry, if it's time of war, they're not offering libations from any of the war. Are they violating women? Absolutely. Why the distinction? It's a very simple distinction. Because the same animal that's released to kill could often be the same animal that is released to ravage the local female population. It's the same animal. That's why, unfortunately, again, you often see in war situations these same type of atrocities committed against women. It's not an accident. It's the same animalistic push that, if left unchecked, results in this behavior. So therefore, the Gemara goes out to Rav Yitzchak bar Elazar Mishpei L'Chizkiya Amar Kan bekarkum shel osa malchus, kan bekarkum shel malchus acheres. Very interesting distinction. The Gemara. So Rav Yitzchak bar Elazar says, it also depends who's laying the siege. See, I will say sometimes the siege is being put down by the local army to protect the residents. Sometimes the siege is being laid in order to go ahead and conquer the city. So I will say it's an interesting distinction. If it's the local army that's laying siege, so to speak, to protect the residents, then we could assume that they're not violating anyone. However, if it's an invading army, that's when we have to assume that they are violating the women. Rashi says, Karkon shel osa malchus, ve'inrotz lahashchis as b'nei ha'ir. Ukishekovish ira samach l'memshalto shomeres shomra v'hi lo lemas. Oved. Okay, so the Gemara is like this. The Gemara says, fine. So the Gemara says, One second. Even let's say it's the local army coming to protect the residents. Do we not assume that still some soldier from the local army, from the quote-unquote friendly army, is still going to take liberties with the local women? To which the Gemara says, no, it's a situation where halacha l'maisa, the army, the local army, the friendly army, so to speak, has set up guard posts, and each guard station sees the other. So even the soldiers can't get into the city to harm the local population. To which the Gemara says, come on. So the Gemara says, porta, is it not possible that again one of the guards in one of the stations falls asleep a little bit, and therefore one of these friendly soldiers is able to get in to harm the local population? First wide line, Amar Levi, Kigon de Mehader le Lamasa, Shoshilta, the Kalba, the Gavza, the Avza. What's the case of Osai? Where the local army went ahead and did something very interesting. That by the entranceway of the city, they put chains, dogs, geese, and spikes. Now what's the chap of all of these things? All of these things will alert the guards if someone is approaching. So the Gemara is just pointing out over here that there is an exception to this rule. Right? This is like Talmudic home security, right? So dogs, spikes, chains, geese. Okay. So the Gemara says this. So therefore, again, that would be a situation where they could ensure that no one was entering the city. Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan argued on this. Chad Amar kan bekarkom shel osa malchus, kan bekarkom shel malchus acheres. I will say again, you can make a distinction. You can make a distinction between if the besieging army is a friendly army or an adversarial army. If it's a friendly army, then you could assume they are not violating the local population. If, however, if it is an invading army, that's when you would have to be concerned. V'lo kashya le v'lo midi v'chad kashya le kolhani umeshani kegon demahadra le lamasa shushilta v'kalba v'gavza v'avza. Okay, so I will say. So the Gemara just suggests over here that halacha l'maisa, there are really two distinctions. Distinction number one is whether or not the siege is being laid by a friendly army or by an invading army. If it's a friendly army, you don't have to assume that anyone's being violated. If it's an invading army, that's when you have to assume. And even with a friendly army, do you have to be concerned with the fact that maybe some of the quote-unquote friendly soldiers will still take advantage of the local population? So one opinion says yes, one opinion says no, and therefore the opinion that says yes would say that the friendly army would place all of these measures in place. The geese, the dogs, the chains, the spikes, so that they would be aware if anyone did try to enter into this city. Okay. Amrav Idi bar Avnei Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yashion. Im yesh sham machboa achos matzelas ala kohanos kulon. They both say this is fascinating. If in the city there is a hiding place, let's say the city has a hiding place. So if the city has a hiding place, that would go ahead and quote unquote save all of the Kohanos, all of the Kohanic wives. Why? Because Rabbi say then we could assume that what? Each of these women took advantage of the hiding place and escaped their captors that way. Rabbi say this is quite fascinating. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Tahorim, so okay, before we get to that. So the idea over here, the Gemara says is like this. If in this city there is a spot where the Ashes coin, the wives of Kohanim, could have escaped their captors, then ultimately, again, we assume that they availed themselves of the hiding spot and therefore were not violated. Incredible halacha. So by Rabbi Yirmiyah, what happens? They will say, what happens if the hiding spot was very small and could only accommodate one woman? One woman. So what's that halacha? Do we assume, Rabbi say, that maybe each Kohenes was the one who hid, and therefore Rabbi say, essentially we look at the women as individuals. We assume she hid, then we look at her, we assume she hid, then in other words, we judge them each individually, and when looked at as individually, halach l'maisa, we could assume that each of them availed themselves of the hiding place, and therefore they're all permitted. O Dilma, lo aminan, or perhaps not. Perhaps not, I will say. Perhaps again, halacha l'maisa. Once we know, see, I will say what's interesting is as follows. In the first case in the Gemara, when the Gemara says if there was a hiding spot in the city, we assume that all of the Kohanic wives are permitted. We must be talking about what kind of hiding spot? What kind of hiding spot? A large one. A large one. Fine. So we could assume that they all availed themselves of the hiding spot. I will say, by the way, when we say that we could assume that they availed themselves of the hiding spot, I just want to point out that in halacha, what that means is we don't have to ask. We don't have to ask. We make assumptions. And I both say, because all of this we're going to see is, we're making a general assumption that in this case, all of the women were violated. So I both say, that's the halacha, that's the chazaka. So, but that also allows us to be mekel when we have something that we could hang the kula on. So therefore, if in a city exists a hiding spot, that is a large hiding spot, we can make the assumption that the women availed themselves of the hiding spot and therefore were not violated. What do I do in a case where the hiding spot was small, so could only go ahead and accommodate one woman? So there are two ways. Either I don't look at the Kohanos as a group, right? How do I look at them? How do I look at them? As individuals. So when I look at each woman's case as an individual, I could say, okay, you hid in the hiding spot. Fine, the case is done. Next case, you hid in the hiding spot. Or no, are we forced to look at them as a group? And as a group, the hiding spot could not accommodate them. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Interesting, why is this different than the case of the two pathways? I both say, watch this case. We've seen this case before. Two paths. Echad tamei ve'echad tahar. I both say two paths. One is tamei, one is tahar. Now watch this. V'halach be'echad mehen ve'asa taros ubachav. So I both say, you went on one of the paths. What's the problem? I don't know which path I went on. I both said, by the way, what a metaphor for life. What a metaphor for life. Two paths in front of me. One tameh, one tar. I both say, I always know. One is tameh, one is tar. What's the greatest problem in life? I often don't know which path I went down. I don't know what I'm doing, right? I don't know which path I went down. So we'll say, now the case over here is like, watch this. So Reuven, right, there are two paths. One is Tameh, one is Tar. Reuven went down the path. He doesn't know which is Tameh, which is Tar. Now, he also was engaged with Taras. Ubachavero, Bahalach B'Sheni, Basa Taros. I will say, here's the case. Reuven went down one path, Shimon went down one path. Opposite, they both right different paths. They both went ahead and touched Taros after they went down the path. So we'll say, what's the halacha? So here we go. So the Gemara says, Im nishal zeh b'fnei atzmo zeh b'fnei atzmo tahoros. So we'll say, if Reuven and Shimon ask their shilas independently, then we could assume that what? Both are tar. Both are tahar, right? Why? Because Rabbi say again, essentially, without getting into all technicalities, this is a case of Safek Tumah Birshus Harabim, Rashi explains. This is a case of a Safek Tumah in a public domain. Safek Tumah in a public domain is always ruled leniently. We always go Lakula. So if they come to ask their questions independently, they're both tar. Shteim Ka'achos Timeos. Have Rabbi say, if they come to ask together, then what? Then they're both tamei. Then I will say, because if they both come to ask together, then I know for sure that's what? What do I know for sure? Someone went down the tamei path. I just don't know who. Set of doubt, I have to rule them both tamei. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi says, Ben kach u ben kach tmein. Rabbi Yossi says, either way, both are tamei. Rabbi Yochanan, no. Bebas achos tevrei kol tmein. If Reuven and Shimon come to ask at the same time, they're both tamei. Bezeh achar zeh divrei kol tahorim. They both say if they come to ask consecutively, they're both tar, because as long as they don't come at the same time, I have the ability to view each of their cases what? Independently. Therefore, Reuven comes, Safek Tumah B'Shus Harabim, tar. Shimon comes, Safek Tumah B'Shus Harabim, tar. Lo nechluku ella bebalishal alav va'al chavero. This is interesting. Where does the machlokes come up? What happens if Reuven comes and he asks about himself and Shimon? About himself and Shimon, right? One opinion says, well, when you ask about yourself and your friend, that's like Reuven and Shimon coming at the same time. And one compares it ultimately to what? To them coming consecutively. So I will say, so therefore, so I will say, or maybe so in this case, so let's come back here. So here we go, I will say, here we go. There's the city. The city was besieged by an invading army. There's a hiding spot. There's a hiding spot in the city. Problem is, the hiding spot only has room for one person. So Rabbi say, how do we view this case? Do we look at this as a case of where each woman is coming to ask her about her status consecutively, one after the other? And if they come one after the other, then what? How do I look at that? They're all tar. Or do I look at it as if they're coming to ask this shaila what? Bebasachos. They're coming as a group. And if they're coming as a group, Rabbi will say, what has to be the psak? What has to be the psak? Tamein. No different than if Reuven and Shimon went down the two paths and came to ask simultaneously, that we would rule them tamei. To which the Gemara says, so Umar medami le'uzachazeh v'achanami kevan deshar l'kulu kibasachas dami. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Hachi hashta hasam vadaika tuma hacha miyemar ditmi. Rabbi said the Gemara says something absolutely startling. The comparison is not fair. See, Rabbi, I'll tell you why. In the case of Reuven and Shimon, Rabbi say, in the two paths, I know that's what. There is definitely tuma. See, Rabbi say, I know one path is tamei, one path is not tamei. One path is tamei, one path is not tamei. See, Rabbi say, so therefore again, halacha l'maisa, right? It's just a question of which path is which. So in that case, it's vaday tuma. Rabbi say, in this case of the city besieged, is there vaday tuma? Was the woman definitely violated? We'll say the truth is the chazaka is that she was violated, but is it definitive? It's not definitive. There's always a piece of us that says maybe she wasn't violated. So maybe Rabbi say the cases aren't comparable. See, in the case of Reuven and Shimon come to ask at the same time, they ask the shayla at the same time. Therefore, what? We have no choice but to rule them tamei, because I know for sure that one of them went down a path of tumah. I just don't know which one. So out of doubt, I have to rule them both tamei. However, in this case, where all of the kohanos are coming, even if you say when it's like bas achos, I don't know definitively that they're tamei or that they're tameos. I don't know. So maybe because of that, even in this case, halacha l'maisa, the presence of a hiding spot even if it could only accommodate one of them, saves all of them. So I will say an interesting idea. So halacha l'maisa. So just so you should know, the way the Rambam paskins in this case is the presence of a hiding spot in the city, whether it could accommodate many people or just one person, saves the kohanos. Because we could assume even if the hiding spot just accommodates one person, we look at each case individually, and as the cases come before us, what could we assume? You're the one who hid, you're the one who hid, you're the one who hid, and the presence ultimately of one hiding spot would save all of the women. Incredible halacha. I'll just tell you, just going back to the other case of Shnei Shavilin. See something amazing. That halacha l'maisa, what do you do in life? There are two paths in front of me, right? One is tamei, one is tahar. That's always the case in life. What's my problem? I'm not, in general, that's a longer answer, right? What's my problem? I don't know which path is tamei, I don't know which path is tahar. So Rabbosai, what's the halacha? What do you do? So Rabbosai, what do you do? Im nishal. The answer is, if you don't know, ask. If you don't know, ask. Or if you don't know if the path that you're going down in life is the right one or not. So find someone who you have confidence. We have a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos of Asei L'Charav. But the concept of Asei L'Charav, make for yourself a Rebbe, doesn't just have to mean someone who's a Rebbe. It means someone in life who you trust to give you guidance about the path that you're taking in life. Ask. Because so many times in life what happens is we go down a derech, we become so vested in the derech, and I'm not really sure, is this the right path or not? But I'm also not brave enough to ask. I'm not willing to make myself vulnerable enough to ask whether it's a Rav, a Rebbe, or a confidant, or someone else who I look to say, you know what? Is this the right path? Is this the right path in life? But if you don't ask, a person could continue life thinking that they're going down the path of Tara, when in fact, chas v'shalom, it is the path of Tumah. Im nishal, if you don't ask, if you don't find someone in life whose guidance and wisdom you respect, and you don't find the courage to make yourself vulnerable enough to ask if the derech you're going down in life is the correct one, you run the risk of spending 120 years on the wrong derech. Incredible Gemara. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, Boy Ravashi, Amra lo nechbesi, velo nitmesi. I'll say, listen to this case. What happens if a woman says, I did not hide, but I also wasn't violated? Interesting. So she comes to us with this claim. There was a hiding spot. I just want to tell you, I did not avail myself of it, but I was not violated. So Mao, I will say, what's the halacha? So mi amrinan amad beis, mi amrinan mali l'shaker. So I will say, we'll say essentially like amigo, right? What's the migo? The migo was, she didn't have to say anything. And if she wouldn't have said anything, we would have said what? We'll say, play this out. She wouldn't have said anything. What would her status have been? Right? Totally tahora. Why? Because we just established the presence of a hiding spot in the city saves the women. So here she's coming along and saying, I didn't hide, but I wasn't violated. So do we say mali l'shakir? Why should she lie? Oh, Dilma, lo amrinan. Or perhaps no. Perhaps again, once she comes along and she tells us that she did not use the hiding spot, unfortunately, she defaults back to the chazaka that she was violated. Why is this different than the following case? Why is it in the following case? Of a man who went ahead and rented a donkey to his friend. I will say, watch this. Amrle, so watch this. Reuven lends the donkey to Shimon. So Reuven says to Shimon, Amrle, lo tezel ba'archa de nahar pakod. Whatever you do, don't take the donkey by the Pakod River, right? Why not? Di'igamaya, because there's always flooding by the Pakod River, and if you go out and you take the donkey on that route, the donkey is going to get swept away by the water. Okay, so the Gemara Zil ba'archa de Narash, go by the Narash road de lakamaya, because there's never any flooding there. Fine. So that's Reuven's the owner, rents the donkey to Shimon with that instruction. Azul ihi ba'archa de Nar Pakod. Sure enough, Shimon takes the donkey by the Pakod River Road, umis chamra, and the donkey died. Now what happened over here? The donkey didn't get swept away by water. What happened? Nebuch, cardiac arrest. Totally healthy donkey, right? Just went for his physical. Right, it happens, right? Just died. Donkey died, cardiac arrest, nothing to do with flooding. Asla kamei Rava. So they came before Rava. So what does Shimon say? In ba'archa dinar pakod azli. I want to be honest. I took the donkey by the Pakoda River Road, but miyu lahavamaya. I just want to tell you, the donkey died of cardiac arrest, not flooding. So I will say, what's happening in this case over here? Shimon is an open book, right? Shimon is telling the truth. He's saying, I took the donkey by the Pakoda River Road, but it had nothing to do with flooding. The donkey's dead, but nothing to do with flooding. So I will say, so Amarava Mali l'shaker. The truth is we should believe Shimon, because Shimon, why would Shimon lie? Shimon could have just as easily said what? What could he have said? He could have said, oh no, I took the donkey by the Narash Road, and the donkey died there. He's being honest, and he's telling us at the end that I took it by the Pakod River Road. So maybe we should believe him. To which the Gemara says, Abaye says, Mali l'shakir b'makom eidim lo amrinan. I will say this is incredible. See, I will say, it's almost as if there's eidos, that there's always water by the Pakod River Road. In other words, that is such a common occurrence that it's almost as if that there's eidos. So I will say, essentially, we do not take Shimon's word in the face of eidos. In the face of eidos. So the Gemara says, Hachi hashta. So perhaps we should compare this to the case of the woman as well. So I will say, so we say the same thing. When the woman comes before us and she says, I didn't hide, but I also wasn't violated. We'll say that's the equivalent of this case, of the donkey case. Why? Because we'll say the same way we don't believe Shimon when he says, I took it by the Pakod River Road, but there wasn't flooding. No, there's always flooding. There's eidos there. Therefore, we don't believe Shimon in the face of eidos. So to again, Abosai, it's almost as if there's eidos when there's that a woman is violated when there's an invading army. So when she says, I didn't hide, but I wasn't violated, we don't believe her in the face of the quote-unquote eidos. What's the eidos? That soldiers violate women. To which the Gemara says, not a fair comparison. Hachi hashta hasam bada ika edem de igamaya hacha vada itmi chashashu or makam chashashu. The Gemara says it's not a fair comparison. Why isn't it a fair comparison? In the case of the flooding by the Pakod River, Abosai, there's always flooding. There's always flood. In other words, that road is always flooded. So there's eidos that there is an actual state. Abosai, in our case of the woman being violated by the soldiers, is it a definitive reality? And the answer is no. No. It's a probable, a highly probable reality, but not definitive. So perhaps, therefore, in that case, I will say, when she says, nichbesi velo nitmesi, that ultimately, again, I was hidden, right? Excuse me, I did not hide, but I was also not violated. In a case like that, halacha l'maisa, perhaps we should believe her, because Rabbi say there is not definitive eidos in that case that in fact she was violated. Incredible. So therefore, again, the Gemara is suggesting over here, what's the Rabbi say? What you see is something really fascinating. You see a theme. What's the theme, Rabbi saying? The theme is that halacha l'maisa, we assume that when there is an invading army, there is a heightened probability that women are violated. But yet, interestingly enough, it's heightened probability. What isn't it? What isn't it? It's not a certainty. It's not a certainty. Therefore, when there's something that erodes the heightened probability, that'll save the women. So there's a hiding spot. There's a hiding spot. Or she comes along and she says, I didn't hide, but I wasn't violated. So she's giving like this mali l'shaker, this migo. Whenever there's something that chips away at the heightened probability, it appears that we will believe her in that case. I will say, we'll have to stop here for today. Don't worry, we're right on target. We're right on schedule. We are fine. Rez Hashem, we'll pick up. We'll start 5:50. Rez Hashem, tomorrow we'll catch up. Shkoyach.
Isn't the case where he says, I went by the Pakod River, but she died, the donkey died, but isn't that Pesha?
Correct.